Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Grace Chapel podcast. Thank you all so much for joining us again today. Today, we're going to continue to dive into our new Christmas series that we've been on here at Grace Chapel called Savior, King, and Word. Mm-hmm. And Paul, you kicked that off 2 weeks ago now, I guess.
2 weeks
talking
ago.
about Savior, going into the Luke Gospel account, talking about Jesus being our Savior. And yesterday, moved on to part 2 about the King. So, Paul, why don't you just tell us a little bit about, first off, just a little bit about this series for anyone who's new, maybe just tuned in, and then more specifically, what did we talk about yesterday with Jesus as the King?
Sure, absolutely. You know, I think it is interesting when if you've spent any time reading these gospel accounts, you'll see that all of these writers have, to some degree, a little bit of a unique angle on Jesus as they're writing to their specific audiences. And so we're looking for the next 3 weeks, or for these 3 weeks in December anyway, at the accounts of Jesus' birth as represented by these gospel authors. Mm-hmm. And really, even at the birth of Jesus, they reflect the thinking that the gospel authors have throughout the rest of their gospel, in a sense. So for Luke to say, when he goes to Zacchaeus' house, when Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' house, for Luke to declare about Jesus, or Jesus to say about himself, in a sense, to say, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And so Luke presents Jesus as Savior. Matthew then presents Jesus as King, and we'll look at that a little bit more today. And then next week we'll see John presents Jesus as the Word, or the Greek in there is the Logos, which there's more in that than just the idea of the Word as we would think about it in English. Mm-hmm. But each one of these gospel writers had a unique view, and so sometimes we talk about John in the sense of having this very high Christology, and what we mean by that is that John shows Jesus to be divine, to be the Son of God, the one who was sent by God, and all the Gospels do, but that's John's emphasis, his deep emphasis. Luke's deep emphasis is really on the fact that we need a Savior, that we're broken people, and Jesus came to broken people. Matthew's emphasis, and we looked at that this week a little bit, as Matthew was writing to the Jewish people primarily about Jesus. So the Jews of the first century were the intended audience of Matthew's gospel, or at least the first intended audience of Matthew's gospel. You have Jesus being represented as the long-awaited King, as the one who was in the lineage of David. And so even Matthew begins, and Luke does too, with Luke begins his gospel as well with basically this genealogy, but Matthew in his genealogy goes back constantly to David, talking about David. And when Matthew even shows when the angel comes to Joseph, you see the angel saying immediately to Joseph, Joseph, son of David. And David, of course, being this king, and this king of Israel, who was given the prophecy, the second king of Israel. But now David really, it's his lineage of kingship that lives throughout the rest of the history of Israel, because Saul was deposed and Jonathan, his son, did not become king. And so it's David's line that leads to the Messiah. And so that is Matthew's focus, saying to these Jewish people, what you've been waiting for since the time of David, 1,000 years before Jesus, what's been talked about since then, this is what is happening as Jesus is coming to earth. This long-awaited King is now coming. So again, Luke represents the fact that we needed a Savior. We need a Savior. And then Matthew talks about the fact that we need a King as well. So we don't just need a Savior, we now also need a King in our life. And so really that's kind of what we spent our time looking at yesterday, is the fact that Jesus came to be the long-awaited King.
Now, you say we need a king, but I think some of us have a hard time with that idea of needing a king.
I mean, that's fair.
I think specifically just in our context of, I think most of our listeners, watchers here are American, are from our country, at least, share some of that heritage of our history. And in our particular context, at least I can say, the idea of kingship isn't that appealing for us, right? Like our country's history with kingship was not that great. So how do we see that as good news? Like, we need a king, but a lot of us are a little uncomfortable with having a king.
Yeah, that's good. If I recall my history correctly, right, it was King George that we
weren't a big fan of him.
in the mid 1770s decided we were done with. You have different things that happen that we celebrate that were actually, in many ways, if you look at them, in an unbiased way, they're acts of rebellion against what was a rightful ruler, King George. But King George was a bad king. And so I think that is our perspective. In fact, if you look at many of Israel's kings, God plainly declares about them that they were not just bad, but they were evil, right? And there were some really good kings. There were those who did right in the sight of God, and then there are those who did evil in the sight of the Lord, just as the nation of Israel did, just as we can as people as well. And so I think our perspective of kingship is often not a good one because we haven't necessarily seen a good king. So Jesus didn't just come to be king and just any other king. He came to be a righteous king, the rightful king, the only king that would ever do the things that kings ought to do in the way that a king ought to be representative of his people, but also be willing to lay down his life for his people. That's when you think about a noble monarch, one that's willing to sacrifice himself on behalf of his people. Well, Jesus obviously did that. So I think, maybe our encounters with nobility have not often proven nobility to be all that noble, and that's problematic. And so, in our nation's history, when we think of kingship, we often rebel against that. But I think it goes deeper than that too. We want to rebel against kingship, especially when that king is bad. So no king for us, we're going to have a president. But even when we disagree with a president, we're pretty quick to rebel against that authority as well. And so is it a problem just with kingship, or is it a problem that we have with authority? We think about even from a very young age, as our kids, and I talked about this yesterday, as my kids have moved into these phases as they've grown older where once they were very dependent upon us for everything. And so what they ate, we decided what they ate. Now we sit at the dinner table and they start to decide what they're going to eat and what they're not going to eat. And sometimes it's this battle, at the dinner table. This is what we fixed. You can eat this, or you cannot have anything to eat before you go to bed tonight, because you're not just going to sit here and waste this food. Well, before, can you imagine if we tried to feed them baby food now? I mean, have you ever, as an adult, maybe at like church camp or something like that, you had to eat baby food because...
I feel certain we've had some students do that
something
on some
like
games
that.
before.
That's right.
Whether I tasted it or not, I'm not sure, but...
So I can remember, this was a number of years ago. I was serving as a church camp counselor, and I got brought before... I think it was called the kangaroo court or something like that. I can't remember, but basically, you're brought on trial for doing something out of line that is just, kind of all made up. But my consequence was that I had to eat a jar of baby food, and I will tell you what, it was nasty. But my kids ate baby food when they were small. They'd never eat that now. In fact, they don't eat the good food sometimes we put in front of them because, they don't necessarily want to eat that food. And even when we say, listen, you need to do this. You need to eat this food. This is good food. This food is good for you. You got to eat this. Sometimes they will rebel and push back against that. And that's just one example. And so we see that from a young age. And then we as adults, we like to be in charge of our lives. We don't necessarily want someone else telling us what to do. So whether it's a king, whether it's a president, whether it's a boss.
You're so right.
We often will resort to the line that kids will use with each other. You're not the boss of me. We definitely feel that pretty strongly sometimes. So I think that's kind of part of our human nature. We want to be at least in charge of ourselves.
Well, and I think we see that at times of what gets more emphasized in a lot of church culture, right? Is that we see a lot about Jesus as our Savior, because there's an extent of that makes us comfortable, that we get excited about that, and rightfully so, right? We should praise Jesus for that. Like, that is a beautiful thing. But sometimes we underemphasize the idea of king, because that really puts it in perspective of Jesus as our authority, and that makes us uncomfortable. And then he starts messing with our lives and saying, you need to live a little differently. And sometimes when we just focus on Savior alone, we tend to think that, I'm covered. Jesus has saved me. I'm good. I can do what I want sometimes. But when you put it in the perspective of king, it gets a little bit more personal. It gets, that authority is there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ben. We talked last week using that Keller quote about the fact that our culture believes they need to be saved from the idea that we need a savior.
Yeah.
So our culture rebels against this idea of needing a savior. What do I need saving from? I'm fine just the way I am, you know, and there are even songs written about that. You know, you're great just the way you are. You're wonderful just the way you are, when the truth of the matter is that we are all broken and we need a savior. And so I think, you know, for those who've become Christians, most people who've I think given their lives to Jesus have accepted the fact that I'm broken, I'm sinful, and I need a savior. Culture rebels against that. But then once you become a Christian, there's this next piece that you can rebel against as well, and it's the fact, and sometimes we talk about that, you know, Jesus didn't just come to be your savior, but he came to be your Lord as well. And so we need to have both a savior and a Lord. Can you have a savior without him being the Lord? Can you have a kingdom without a king? You know, I mean, all these, I think, very valid questions, you know. So the culture rebels against the need for a savior, but Christians rebel against the need for a king as well in their lives. And so, I think you're spot on. We push back against that.
So you kind of, I think, illuminated that in an interesting way yesterday, where you were talking about Herod, and you kind of said that to some degree, many of us share some of Herod's struggle. What do you mean by that? Explain that to us a little bit, because that one can rub you the wrong way a little bit. Like,
I think that's fair.
Comparing us to Herod.
Well, let me recap the Matthew 2 story just a little bit that we spent some time in yesterday, since I haven't done that yet. But Matthew 2, we see this story of these magi coming from the east, and they come to Jerusalem. They've been following this star. We know this scene, right? This is, we've got the little stable and the shepherds, and just outside the circle of the shepherds, you've got your wise men with their gifts. And in all reality, the wise men came some time after the shepherds had been there at Jesus' birth. Jesus had been alive for, scholars think anywhere between, maybe 1 and 2 years at that point in time, by the time the shepherds actually came, which is why Herod orders, well, we'll get to that piece too, the death of all young male children born under age 2 in Bethlehem. But the Magi come to Jerusalem. They're looking for Jesus. They, for some reason, seem to have gotten lost. They've lost their way. I don't know what happened with the star. Maybe it wasn't quite as specific as it needed to be in the direction that it pointed them, but it brought them to Jerusalem anyway. Bethlehem not far from Jerusalem, of course. They're coming from the east. They had gotten mostly to where they were supposed to be. And so you get this scene where the Magi, who are wise men and highly thought of anyway, they were royalty in a sense themselves in one way, or at least nobility. They come and they're able to get this kind of hearing at Herod's court. They ask Herod, "We're looking for the one who's been born King of the Jews. Do you know where he is?" And Luke gives us this, or Matthew gives us this insight right away that says Herod was greatly troubled at this question, and all of Jerusalem with him, because Herod was king. And so if you get this, if you get a bunch of people coming in saying, and especially Magi, who were kind of the kingmakers of the Near East at that point in time, when they come asking, where's the new king, Herod would have been familiar with that kind of Near Eastern tradition, and he was very troubled. Who are these Magi coming looking for a new king? And so he goes to his chief priests and his wise men, the wise men of Israel, to ask them, where was this king, this long-awaited king, supposed to be born? They tell him in Bethlehem. Herod goes back and tells the Magi in Bethlehem. The Magi go to Bethlehem. They find Jesus. They're warned at this point in time, don't go back to Herod. So Herod finds out that the Magi outwitted him and tricked him, because Herod's deal was, hey, go find him, then come back to me, tell him where he is. I want to go and worship him too, which was not true, of course. Herod did not want to worship Jesus. Herod wanted to take care of Jesus, to get rid of Jesus. And so the Magi go back to their homeland by a different route, and Herod is now extremely angry. And so what he decides to do, he can't get rid of Jesus specifically. He decides to get rid of all these young male children under the age of 2 in the town of Bethlehem. So he issues this edict. And so, obviously a terrible, terrible thing. I mean, he ordered the murder of innocents to protect his position, his status, his power, his kingship in that sense. History tells us that Herod was a pretty ruthless guy, so this is not out of character for him at all. In fact, we learn in history that Herod actually had several members of his own family killed in order to preserve his position because he thought that they were potentially a threat to his line. And so not a wonderful guy, not a warm king, not a good king, another bad king. And so again, it kind of goes to continue to support that feeling that we have about kings. And if you had a king like Herod, you wouldn't want another king, that's for sure. But I want you to think about what Herod did. Herod wanted to be king so badly that he was willing to go to great lengths, even those of committing fairly atrocious acts, evil acts, in order to continue to hold that position in his own life and over the area of Judea. And so I said yesterday, that sometimes we're a little bit like Herod when it comes to what we'll do in our own lives to at least be in control of our own lives, to be king of our own lives. So I wrote an article for Renew.org, an organization that we engage with here at Grace Chapel, and I'll go ahead and I'll link that article, make sure that's linked in the video description as well. But I wrote an article where I basically made that case. I told the story and then said, you and I are not that different from Herod in this way. We want to be king of our lives. We want to be in charge. I want to at least be king over the kingdom of me, right? You want to be king over your own little kingdom. We all want to be king over our little kingdoms. Maybe we're not saying I've got to rule everything, but I need to be in charge of what's going on with me. But the trouble is, just like Herod, and here's where we're also like Herod, is that Herod was, in a sense, he was an imposter king. I mean, he really was. He was not the rightful king. Jesus was the rightful king. But when I reflect as well, anytime I try to be king of my life, I'm an imposter also. There's only one who is the rightful king of my life, and that's Jesus. Especially if I'm a Christ follower and I've given my life to him. We talked yesterday as well about, when people are baptized here at Grace Chapel, we ask them 3 questions. And one is a question of identity. Do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the one that he was sent to be? He was sent to be the king. So he's the Son of God and God's one and only anointed king. And so we ask people, do you affirm that? Do you believe that about Jesus' identity? And then the second piece is, do you believe that Jesus did what he said he would do, that he came to do, that he gave his life on the cross so that he could become our Savior? But then the third piece is this question about what you choose to do in response to that. And it goes something like this. From this day forward, will you follow Jesus to the best of your ability, without excuse or without exception? Will you follow him to the best of your ability? Because that is the response you have to one who is the rightful king of your life. You'll say that wherever you call me to go, whatever you're asking me to do or be, I will say yes, because you're the king. But like Herod, we'd rather be king of our own lives sometimes. And so that's difficult. That's tough.
That's really good. That's good. So Paul, if we were to kind of boil this down and give us like a practical takeaway, what would it be? What would you say the takeaway from that message is, something that we can do this week?
Yeah, that's good. And I think with this one, it requires some self-reflection. I think the truth is that all of the Christian life is really about learning to surrender, is about learning to give up control of our lives and the way we'd want things to go to the God who loves us, and really to a good king.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need to touch on that and say, really, where it might, certainly it would strike us as something that's not desirable if we were giving up control to someone who did not have our best interests at heart, and someone who would use that control or that authority in an abusive way. That doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
But when we give up control to Jesus, we're giving up control to a good king. I mean, we're actually saying at that point in time, I'm surrendering but the acknowledgement is I'm surrendering because I know what I'm surrendering to is better than anything I could do on my own. You know, so that's this admission. I'm not a great king. So all of the Christian life is really then about surrendering our will to His will. If you think about, the three synoptic gospels all include this idea of taking up our cross daily to follow after Jesus, and that's so. Is that Mark 8, Luke 9, and Matthew 10? It's an easy way to remember that. It just goes in succession that way. So Mark talks about that in 8, Luke 9, and then Matthew 10. Matthew talks about it again, I think, in maybe 18, somewhere in that ballpark. And so there is this call for us to take up our cross daily and to follow Him. But there's also this promise of Jesus that when we say yes to following Him, that His yoke is easy and His burden is light. It's the best thing we're going to do. He's going to walk this along with us. And so I think for us, for practical application this week, it's one, do I believe as a Christ follower that giving up my will to God is really the best thing? That's the first thing. I think, so some practical reflection. And I know you love to journal, and so maybe challenging folks to journal is a good thing on this one as well, to journal that, whatever your answer happens to be. And for most of us, I think it's going to be yes.
Give me that question one more time.
Right. So do I really believe that giving up my will to God, to God's will, to take on the will of God instead, or replacing my will with the will of God for my life is really the best thing?
Okay.
Is it really the best thing? Now God will tell you unequivocally, yes, this is the best thing. This is exactly what you need to do. But again, I think our answer for many of us, it'll be yes, and then there'll be a caveat. It'll be yes, but in there somewhere. But then beyond that, what is one way that you could surrender more fully to the kingship of Jesus in your life? Because Matthew leaves no doubt about it, that Jesus came to be king. Not just king of Israel, not just king of the Jews, as the wise men represent to Herod, but He came to be king of everything. I mean, when we think about the way Matthew ends his gospel with Jesus saying these words, and we know the Great Commission, but Jesus says these words, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore," because that's true. So in other words, Jesus is saying, now obviously he lands on the Great Commission at that point, but I think there could be many things that come after that, therefore, because of. So I think it's good to ask the question, if all authority in heaven and on earth belongs to Jesus, what does that mean for me?
Yeah.
What is one thing I could do this week to surrender myself more fully to the kingship of Jesus, so that He's king and that I'm not? And here's the thing, we're going to find out as we go, He's a much better king than you or I will ever be.
Yeah. I love that. That's really good. So that's a step to be working on. There's some homework out of that, maybe take some time, write out those thoughts. I like that. So Paul, thank you for that. And next week, I guess we'll be moving on to the third part in this series, looking at Jesus as the Word. Yeah. So, y'all, if you want to be kind of looking ahead of this, you're welcome to be reading John chapter 1. Yeah,
verses 1 through 14. That's
1
where
through
we'll
14.
be. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Well, thank y'all.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Just want to say again, it's good news that Jesus came to be our King. Yeah. Because you and I don't have to figure it out on our own. So I want you to take hope in that as you go this week. God bless you.
I love it. Thank y'all.